What if kings weren't just drunk on power, but addicted to something stranger? Behind every crown lies a compulsion, glittering, grotesque, or quietly unhinged. One hoarded clocks like lifelines, another vanished into starlight. One couldn't stop touching strangers to heal them. These weren't hobbies. They were obsessions that shaped history, toppled dynasties, and left royal corridors echoing with sugar highs, perfume clouds, and paranoid prayers. Tonight, we're digging through the velvet-lined madness of monarchy. 25 English monarchs, 25 strange addictions. Some will make you laugh, some will make you shiver. All of them will make you wonder who really ruled whom. Before we dive headfirst into royal obsessions, make sure you're subscribed. This channel is where history gets weird, and we like it that way. And hey, while you're here, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester, 3 a.m. in Texas. We're building a global court of insomniacs and curiosity junkies. You belong here. 1. Henry VIII, gambling obsession. There's something almost childishly tragic about Henry VIII. Not the bloated tyrant with the turkey leg. That caricature is overdone. No, the real tragedy was this. He couldn't stand to lose, and he kept inventing games just so he could watch himself win. Except he didn't. Henry VIII had an addiction, and it wasn't just to power, women, or food, though check, check, and check. His most persistent vice, the one that gnawed at him through youth and into obesity, was gambling. Dice, cards, bowls, backgammon. If it could be bet on, Henry was already halfway through his fortune trying to win it. And if he did win, you could be sure that everyone else at the table had been warned to lose gracefully. But the truly strange part wasn't the gambling itself. Monarchs wasting fortunes was a tradition as old as thrones. What made Henry's case so compelling, so psychologically itchy, was his compulsive need to not just gamble, but to control the outcome and pretend he hadn't. He wanted the illusion of risk and the certainty of victory, which is to say, Henry wanted the universe to conspire in his favor without admitting he asked it to. Contemporary records show him losing vast sums, hundreds of pounds at a time, which translates to astronomical losses today. And yet, courtier after courtier kept showing up at the table, grimacing as they accidentally rolled snake eyes or fumbled a full house. After all, nothing ruined your odds like winning against the king. There's an anecdote, possibly apocryphal but too delicious to ignore, in which Henry gambled away a golden cup to a French ambassador during a state visit. The ambassador, awkward but polite, tried to refuse. Henry insisted, so the ambassador took it. The next day, Henry demanded it back and accused the man of theft. Apparently, diplomacy, like dice, had its own hidden rules. The deeper irony? Henry wasn't good at any of these games. He just kept playing, over and over, like he believed that the next roll, the next hand, the next coin toss might fix something deeper than his balance sheet. It never did, but the noise of the table gave him a reason not to listen to the noise in his own head. One night, he lost over £3,000 playing dice. That's roughly £500,000 in today's terms. For what? A few hours of watching people pretend to lose, and then he'd do it again and again. But addiction never respects scale. For a peasant, gambling might cost a loaf of bread. For a king, it costs a war chest, a treasury, sometimes a crown. Henry didn't care. He had already gambled his soul on bigger things: divorces, papal schisms, national identity. In that light, losing a few thousand at cards must have felt quaint. Still, he never stopped. He had custom-made dice, monogrammed playing cards, private gaming rooms built into his palaces. His obsession was so overt that foreign dignitaries would study the games in advance, trying to learn how best to lose without looking like they were throwing the match. Losing to Henry became its own kind of etiquette. Of course, he never gambled alone. That would have been too honest. And when he wasn't playing, he was watching others play, often commenting from the sidelines like a drunk coach at a Sunday league game. His court became a theatre of performance losses, choreographed chants, and tight smiles. Behind every role was the fear of offending the man who thought himself God's favourite gambler. There's also something childlike about his fixation, a desperation to make randomness bend to his will, a belief that if he just played one more round, the universe might finally say, "You win." But the universe doesn't do favourites, it just watches and rolls. Towards the end of his life, Henry was hardly recognisable, bloated, paranoid, rarely leaving his chambers, except, of course, to gamble. His legs were ulcerated, his court was terrified, his wives were either dead or dodging eye contact, but the dice still clattered across the table. That sound, the cheap echo of fate, never left him. In the end, Henry didn't lose because of cards or dice. He lost because he thought he could cheat chance itself, that by sheer will or divine right he could force randomness to become destiny. But luck doesn't kneel, even to kings. And while Henry tried to charm fortune with games, another monarch, his great-great-nephew, tried to fight vice with words, not by indulging in a craving, but by becoming obsessed with hating it. That king was James I, and he launched a war not on cards or dice, but on smoke itself. 2. James I, tobacco mania. James I had a problem with smoke, not the kind that rises from bonfires or wafts out of fireplaces. No, his war was with the elegant curling kind, the social kind, the fashionable, addictive leaf-borne kind, tobacco, and not just smoking it, though he did dabble briefly, with the furrowed brow of a man trying to understand why people enjoyed things. No, James's addiction was far stranger than mere puffing and coughing. He became consumed with hating tobacco, obsessively, righteously, compulsively. It was as if the idea of someone somewhere enjoying a pipe was enough to launch him into a printed, pamphlet-length fit. What began as distaste turned to disgust, then ballooned into a full-blown fixation. And if you think that sounds like an overstatement, consider this. James I published an entire treatise, a counterblast to tobacco, which was, in essence, a royal tantrum committed to ink and paper. It was aggressive, it was theatrical, and it was utterly unhinged. In this passionate work, James described tobacco as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. 4 for 4, really. But it wasn't just the content of his rage, it was the energy with which he pursued it. James was a king on a moral mission, and he wielded his quill like a sword. The irony? His own courtiers smoked constantly. Pipes were as common at court as gossip. Even his son, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, allegedly took a liking to it. But James saw tobacco as the devil's breath, a foreign invader, a moral rot wafting through the nostrils of the nation. To understand his obsession, you have to understand James himself. This was not a relaxed man. This was a king born of violent legacies, raised in instability and crowned over a fragile union. He was anxious, deeply suspicious, and prone to fixating on enemies both real and imagined. And in tobacco, he found the perfect symbolic enemy, foreign, corrupting, beloved by fools. But here's the twist. James's hatred of tobacco didn't come from nowhere. He was something of a walking contradiction, a deeply learned man, fluent in theology, philosophy, and paranoia. He believed himself divinely appointed, yet was utterly terrified of what common people might be doing without his permission. And when it came to tobacco, he feared not just its smell, but its symbolism. This wasn't about smoke, it was about control. He watched as smoking swept through England like a plague, an imported, American-born, Spanish-flavoured vice. And worse, it wasn't just the poor lighting up. Nobles, scholars, ambassadors. The upper crust were suddenly obsessed with puffing and exhaling as if their thoughts had become visible. And for James, it was appalling. Not because it was new, but because it was out of his hands. Tobacco didn't need his approval. It didn't wait for royal sanction. It just spread like wildfire, or wildfire's lazy cousin. That's when his anti-smoking rhetoric became ritual. He taxed it. He ranted about it in council. He issued proclamations. He shamed anyone who smoked in his presence. And still the pipes kept burning. Even his own courtiers learned to puff discreetly, behind curtains or in secret gardens, while offering insincere coughs of agreement with the king's latest decree. It's easy now, centuries later, to laugh at a counterblast to tobacco. It reads like an Elizabethan Yelp review from someone who just walked into a cigar lounge by accident. But to James, it wasn't satire, it was salvation. He believed truly that his words might stop the tide, that reason and royal rage might extinguish the embers. They didn't. In fact, after his death, tobacco use exploded. And here's the deeper, stranger irony. For all his hatred of smoking, James's obsession mirrored addiction in every meaningful way. He thought about tobacco constantly, wrote about it, legislated around it, tailored his social life to avoid it. The object of loathing became the center of gravity. If Henry VIII tried to conquer chance, James I tried to conquer choice. He couldn't stand that people, commoners, nobles, even his own blood, might freely choose something he deemed vile, and so he fought it with ink and fury. And like most royal campaigns, it changed everything and absolutely nothing. There's something oddly modern about his crusade. The moral panic, the health concerns laced with nationalism, the way a single object, a leaf, a habit, a puff of smoke, became a stand-in for all that was wrong with the world. James I never won his war on tobacco, but he did leave behind one of the earliest anti-smoking pamphlets in European history. A footnote in medicine, perhaps. A manifesto in obsession, definitely. And yet, for all his posturing, all his proclamations, James still couldn't stop the smoke from spreading. But not all royal addictions were so abstract. Some weren't ideological or symbolic at all. Some were physical, hands-on, ritualistic, and deeply medieval, like the strange, compulsive habit of a later monarch who believed his very touch could heal disease. And while James I was busy waging a personal war against tobacco, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what ungodly hour is it? Drop your location and time in the comments. I guarantee someone else is wide awake with you, wondering why monarchs were this unhinged. If you're enjoying the madness, don't forget to subscribe. This rabbit hole only gets deeper, and trust me, you'll want company. 3. Charles II, the royal touch. Charles II loved attention. Not the cold, formal kind offered by trembling diplomats in powdered wigs, but the theatrical, myth-drenched variety. He liked applause, he liked mystique, and above all, he liked being looked at the way ancient kings were supposed to be, not just obeyed, but believed in. So when Charles resurrected the medieval ritual known as the royal touch, the idea that a king could heal the sick with a mere graze of his hand, he wasn't just playing make-believe, he was diving headfirst into the role of a living miracle. And like most addictions, it started gradually. A few ceremonies, a handful of desperate pilgrims, a symbolic gesture here or there. But very quickly, Charles became obsessed. He wasn't just performing the ritual occasionally, he was doing it constantly, thousands of times over. At its peak, he was touching as many as 100 people a day, sometimes more, all suffering from scrofula, or what they called then the king's evil, a form of tuberculosis that left grotesque lumps on the neck. The patients would be lined up, some travelling hundreds of miles, others carried in stretchers. Charles would appear robed and regal, sometimes with music playing. He would press his fingers lightly to the afflicted, make the sign of the cross, hand them a coin, and move on to the next, over and over, for hours. And he loved it. To modern eyes, it looks delusional. But to Charles, it was validation. A stage performance with divine implications. Every touch reinforced the idea that he wasn't just a man wearing a crown. He was meant to be king, chosen, sanctified, not just ruling by law, but by miracle. And Charles needed that belief more than most, because Charles didn't come to power like other monarchs. He clawed his way back after a civil war, a regicide, and an 11-year monarchy-free experiment called the Commonwealth. His father, Charles I, had been executed by Parliament. The monarchy had been abolished, and when Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, he inherited a country that didn't entirely trust him or the concept of kings at all. So what did he do? He made himself indispensable. He performed kingship like theatre, lavish court, sparkling wit, endless mistresses, and crucially, the touch. It wasn't just public relations, it was a psychological lifeline. For Charles, the ritual fused together three of his deepest cravings: affirmation, control, and a sense of mystical relevance. In a world where science was emerging, where power was shifting, and where rebellion still simmered beneath the surface, Charles chose to double down on magic, and people believed it. The sick came in droves. Chroniclers wrote of miraculous recoveries, whether real, imagined, or heavily edited. Even foreign visitors were fascinated by the spectacle. To them, this wasn't just superstition, it was power. The king healing the people, not through policy, but with skin. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Enlightenment thinkers rolled their eyes. Physicians muttered in the corridors. Even some clergy found it a bit much, but Charles didn't care. He wasn't trying to convince skeptics. He was performing for believers. And here's the curious thing. It worked not because it cured disease, but because it meant something. In a nation still traumatized by war, regicide, and puritanical austerity, the royal touch felt like stability wrapped in wonder. A ritual of reassurance, a gesture that said, "The king is back. The order has returned, and look, he's healing us." But rituals don't remain static. They become habits, and habits, when performed obsessively, become something else entirely. By the end of his reign, Charles had reportedly touched over 90,000 people. That's not a typo. 90,000. The sheer physicality of it is staggering. Day after day, week after week, touching the sick, handing out coins, repeating the incantation. Some kings wrote laws. Charles laid hands, and he never stopped, even when it was clear that the healing was symbolic at best, even when other rulers quietly phased it out, even when public health officials began whispering about contagion and transmission. Charles kept touching, because this wasn't about medicine, it was about mythology, about ritual as performance. And Charles, ever the showman, knew better than anyone that belief is stronger than proof. So he doubled down, not just because he thought it worked, but because he needed it to work, for his own legitimacy, for the image of the monarchy, and perhaps most tragically for the idea that he, unlike his father, could survive the crown without bleeding for it. There's a final irony here. Charles died in 1685. After suffering a sudden and mysterious illness. His final days were filled with conflicting treatments, prayers, and of course rituals, but no one could lay hands on him and make it all go away. The king who touched 90,000 others couldn't be touched himself, and yet his legacy lived on, not in policy, not in empire, but in the strange echo of a king who treated public belief like medicine. But Charles wasn't the only monarch with an addiction to illusions. One of his more flamboyant successors would trade miracle cures for something far more intoxicating: clouds of perfume, mountains of fragrance, and the lingering scent of a man who couldn't stand to smell like anything less than legend. 4. George IV. Perfume hoarding. George IV never met a mirror he didn't love, or a bottle of cologne he couldn't hoard. His addiction wasn't subtle. It came in crystal decanters, imported boxes, and ornate atomizers that lined the shelves of every room he touched. If Henry VIII was obsessed with feasting and power, and Charles II with the illusion of divine healing, then George IV, dandy, dreamer, debt sinker, was addicted to scent. Overwhelming, opulent, suffocating scent. To understand this addiction, you must first understand the man himself. George IV was, in many ways, a paradox. He longed to be taken seriously, as a ruler, as a tastemaker, as a modern monarch, yet often presented himself like a caricature of royal excess. He was flamboyant, insecure, insatiably vain, and pathologically sensitive to how he was perceived. And in this strange emotional cocktail, perfume became more than accessory. It became armor. His obsession began young. As Prince of Wales, George was already drowning in colognes. He reportedly ordered hundreds of bottles at a time from perfumers in France, Italy, and beyond. Lavender, musk, rosewater, orange blossom, sandalwood. There was no scent too rare, no vial too ornate, no price too absurd. While his subjects struggled under rising taxes and the consequences of wars, George was sending royal messengers to procure obscure Eastern oils at ruinous prices. The problem wasn't hygiene. George wasn't bathing more than anyone else in the Georgian era, which is to say, barely, but he was masking more than anyone. His scent entered a room before he did, and stayed long after he left. Visitors to Carlton House, his lavish London residence, often reported being nearly choked by the cloud of fragrance that lingered in his chambers. Courtiers learned quickly to compliment the aroma, even as their eyes watered and heads spun. But this was more than vanity. George's perfume addiction was a sensory coping mechanism. He was terrified of illness, particularly those he couldn't see. He believed, like many at the time, that bad smells caused disease. So perfume, in his mind, wasn't just decoration, it was protection. He wasn't drowning himself in scent out of indulgence. He was, in his own anxious logic, building an invisible fortress against death. And yet, even that wasn't the full story. The perfume wasn't merely functional. It was emotional. It was theatrical. George used fragrance the way other monarchs used armies, to assert dominance, to declare his presence, to remind everyone who the center of the world was. His valet once claimed that George changed colognes multiple times a day. Morning scent, afternoon scent, evening scent, scent for meals, scent for naps, scent for diplomatic meetings, scent for his dogs. Every emotion had its own olfactory vocabulary. Every moment had a matching bottle. And like all addicts, George couldn't stop. His private apartments were overflowing. Cabinets groaned under the weight of unused vials. He commissioned custom-blended fragrances from perfumers who catered only to him, with names that no one else could request, in formulas that were kept secret. He even insisted that his clothing be soaked in scent before wear, sometimes days in advance. The result? A monarch who smelled less like a man and more like a mobile apothecary. Even his enemies took notice. Political satirists mocked him as a preening, over-scented joke. Caricatures in the press showed him swimming in perfume bottles, unable to see over clouds of lavender mist. But George didn't care, or if he did, he just sprayed over the insult. It's tempting to dismiss this as mere extravagance, but beneath the layers of sandalwood and violet was a deeper, more human anxiety. George was deeply insecure about his weight, his role, his legacy, his relationship with his father. Perfume offered something no amount of royal power could guarantee: the illusion of control over how he was remembered. Because scent, more than sight or sound, lingers. It stains memory. It slips into the cracks of experience and refuses to leave. And George wanted desperately to be unforgettable, even if it meant his reign smelled like desperation and rosewater. By the time he became king in 1820, George was physically bloated, emotionally volatile, and financially ruined. But his perfumes still perfectly curated. Even in his later years, when gout left him immobile and digestion was a constant problem, his cologne collection expanded. Bottles lined his sick room. Servants were instructed to spray his pillows. He may have lost his health, his popularity, and his dignity, but he would not, under any circumstances, lose his scent. And so he died, enveloped in fragrance, cloaked in a fog of musk and memory. A man whose legacy was, quite literally, in the air. But while George tried to conquer decay with perfume, one of his distant ancestors went in the opposite direction, embracing rot, sugar, and the sweetly grotesque, a queen who turned her mouth into a shrine for candy, and whose love of confections left a legacy that was anything but sweet. 5. Elizabeth I, sugar cravings. Elizabeth I ruled with calculated ferocity, wielding language like a weapon, diplomacy like a dance, and her own image like a sacred artifact. She was, in many ways, the first modern political brand, carefully curated, dangerously intelligent, and astonishingly aware of the power of appearance. But beneath the layers of pearls, powdered lead, and razor-sharp rhetoric was a queen quietly undone by an addiction not to power, but to something far more insidious: sugar. Elizabeth's obsession with sweets was the kind of quiet, slow-burn addiction that wouldn't have drawn the scandal of court whispers the way a gambling habit or a parade of lovers might. But make no mistake, it was just as destructive and just as revealing. To understand the nature of this craving, you have to understand the role sugar played in Tudor England. In the 16th century, sugar wasn't a pantry staple. It was a luxury, a symbol, a foreign delicacy imported from colonial ports and laced with social status. It appeared in banquets like treasure. It was molded into animals, castles, mythical creatures. It was sculpted, dyed, perfumed, and displayed as much as it was eaten. And Elizabeth didn't just partake in these sugary marvels. She hoarded them, commissioned them, consumed them with a devotion that bordered on ritual. Her feasts were famous for their elaborate sugar work, subtleties, as they were called, culinary sculptures made entirely of sweetened paste and icing, each more ostentatious than the last. It was theatre, yes, but it was also deeply personal, because for Elizabeth, sugar wasn't just a treat, it was transformation. She used it to create illusions, to sculpt herself in sweetness, to polish the edges of a world she couldn't always control. Her court could be brutal, her enemies were legion, her legitimacy was constantly under fire. But sugar was compliant, sugar bent to her will. Contemporaries wrote of her fondness for candied violets, rose-petal preserves, sweetmeats shaped like crowns, and marzipan molded into royal insignias. Her servants reportedly spent hours preparing delicacies that would vanish in minutes, only to be replaced by new confections just as extravagant. She was known to keep private stashes of sugar-coated almonds and candied ginger, which she would consume during council meetings and private audiences alike. But the addiction left its mark, and not metaphorically. By her later years, Elizabeth's teeth were famously blackened, so much so that foreign diplomats began to mention them in dispatches. Some even mistook the condition as a fashionable affectation, and there are apocryphal accounts of noble women darkening their own teeth to emulate the Queen. In reality, it was the result of years, decades of unchecked sugar consumption. The price of sweetness, as it turned out, was decay. Still, Elizabeth made no visible effort to curb the habit. She continued to attend elaborate sugar banquets, to smile carefully with painted lips, and to command a nation while nursing an obsession that quietly gnawed away at her from within. And perhaps that's the most Elizabethan thing about it. She ruled in contradictions. The virgin queen who was never alone, the untouchable monarch who manipulated touch, the woman who turned sweetness into strategy, and in doing so revealed just how fragile power could be. Because for all her intellectual brilliance, for all her political cunning, Elizabeth I was still human, still hungry, and still susceptible to the same soft addictions that undo lesser figures. But unlike others, she turned her craving into theatre. She turned sugar into spectacle. She made rot look regal. And maybe that was the point. Because if a queen could devour sweetness and still command fear, still hold the loyalty of her subjects, still outwit empires, then maybe, just maybe, indulgence wasn't weakness. Maybe it was power, dressed in gold leaf and candied orange peel. Still, sugar wasn't the only thing that Elizabeth couldn't resist. And she wasn't the only monarch who found herself tangled in a sweet-smelling spiral. Her successor, James VI of Scotland and the First of England, would inherit the throne, the crown, and something much darker, a burning obsession not with sweetness but with sin, and a frantic, compulsive desire to hunt it out wherever it hid. 6. James VI and the First, witch-hunting. James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, was many things: the scholarly son of the doomed Mary, Queen of Scots, the first ruler of a united British crown, a compulsive writer with a flair for long-winded treatises, and perhaps most infamously, a king who saw witches in every corner of his realm. His obsession wasn't political at first, it was personal, and like most dangerous obsessions, it masqueraded as righteousness. James didn't simply believe in witchcraft, he feared it, needed to fear it. He breathed it in like smoke and chased it with the zeal of a man who saw himself as chosen to cleanse the world. In the late 16th century, witch-hunting wasn't unique to Scotland. Continental Europe was awash with trials, burnings, and wild accusations. But James didn't just follow the trend, he helped supercharge it. He wasn't content to let ministers and magistrates handle the problem. He waded into it himself, robes and all, demanding testimony, attending trials, and interrogating suspects personally. It began with a storm. In 1589, James sailed to Denmark to retrieve his bride Anne of Denmark. The return voyage was plagued by violent weather. Ships were forced back to shore, and many nearly sank. James, devout and suspicious, concluded that this wasn't merely misfortune, it was witchcraft. Someone, somewhere, had summoned this storm, and he was going to find them. The result was the North Berwick witch trials, one of the first large-scale witch hunts in Scotland. Over 70 people were implicated. Torture, confessions, and public executions followed. James wasn't merely a passive observer. He saw himself as a kind of spiritual detective, uncovering the devil's agents one by one. And once he had started, he couldn't stop. In 1597, James published Demonology, a philosophical and theological defense of witch hunting, written in the form of a dialogue. In it, he dismissed skeptics, justified torture, and laid out the logic for rooting out the diabolical. The book wasn't just a personal project, it became state policy. Under his influence, witch hunting in Scotland reached terrifying new heights. James saw witchcraft not as a marginal superstition, but as a real existential threat to his reign. To him, witches weren't just fringe figures. They were political saboteurs, spiritual terrorists. They were, in his mind, tools of Satan sent to undermine divine kingship. And what could be more threatening to a man so obsessed with authority than invisible forces working against him? Even when he ascended to the English throne in 1603, James carried his obsession south with him. England had been relatively restrained in its witch trials compared to the continent, but James's arrival shifted the tone. He encouraged Parliament to strengthen the Witchcraft Act. He oversaw high-profile trials. And although his fervour would mellow somewhat in his later years, the seeds he planted grew long after his reign. Historians debate whether James truly believed in witches or whether he used them as convenient scapegoats. But his writings, speeches, and direct involvement in trials suggest something deeper, something compulsive. This wasn't just a political tool, it was a belief system, a cosmology, a lens through which he filtered his fears and justified his actions. And it wasn't without cost. Innocent lives were destroyed, entire communities were plunged into paranoia, and a culture of suspicion took root that would echo for generations. All because one man, cloaked in power and certainty, couldn't stop seeing shadows in the corners of his court. But there's a deeper irony here. James, for all his education and sophistication, was terrified of forces he claimed to understand. His witch hunting wasn't just a crusade against heresy, it was an elaborate way of managing fear. Fear of death, fear of disloyalty. Fear that his authority, so carefully inherited and precariously maintained, could be undone by unseen hands. In the end, James's obsession wasn't really with witches, it was with control. Witches were simply the perfect target, invisible enemies that only he could identify, accuse, and vanquish. They gave shape to his anxieties, and for a while, purpose to his rule. But not all royal compulsions were as destructive as James's. Some were quieter, more private, and strangely tender. One king, centuries earlier, found comfort not in persecution, but in pilgrimage, a sacred loop of walking, praying, and yearning for visions that never came. 7. Henry VI, pilgrimage mania. Henry VI was a king born into chaos, crowned as an infant, and destined to rule a kingdom he could barely understand. From the moment he inherited the English throne at just 9 months old, his reign was shaped by the ambitions of others, regents, lords, foreign powers, and fate itself. And yet, as he grew into a pale, soft-spoken figurehead, Henry found his own curious outlet for sovereignty. Not through conquest, not through courtly splendor, but through an addiction to walking, specifically walking toward shrines. Henry VI was addicted to pilgrimage. In an age where kings defined themselves through war, marriage, and bloodlines, Henry was perpetually drifting toward chapels, relics, and holy wells. He walked to pray, he walked to escape, he walked because he believed truly, deeply, that if he humbled himself enough before the sacred, God might speak back. At first glance, it seemed harmless, even noble. Medieval kings were expected to be pious, and pilgrimage was a respected ritual. But for Henry, it became something else entirely, a compulsion, an all-consuming need to leave the political realm behind and enter a realm of sacred geography. When the crown demanded leadership, Henry often vanished physically and spiritually into a kind of devotional haze. His advisors would find him at obscure shrines, prostrate before saintly statues, or muttering prayers in dim candlelight. He sought divine visions, the way other monarchs sought battlefield glory. The more unstable the kingdom became, the more frequently he departed, and England was unstable. The 100 Years' War was sputtering to its bitter conclusion, and unrest was brewing at home. But Henry, caught between sacred silence and worldly noise, preferred the company of monks to ministers. Instead of raising armies, he raised his hands in prayer. Instead of drafting strategies, he traced to the roots of old saints' paths. His obsession was so intense that he would sometimes spend weeks journeying to a single site, barefoot, in poor weather, with a meager entourage, just to pray for visions that never quite materialized. Pilgrimage for Henry was more than ritual. It was therapy, a retreat from the unbearable weight of rulership. He was a king who hated conflict, recoiled from confrontation, and seemed allergic to politics. But in the slow rhythm of pilgrimage, the footfall, the chant, the repetition, he found something resembling peace. His favorites included Walsingham, Canterbury, and Windsor, all sites associated with healing, miracles, or royal martyrdom. He visited them repeatedly, almost obsessively, as if retracing the same path might finally open the heavens. He also founded his own sacred spaces, most famously King's College Chapel in Cambridge and Eton College, both drenched in religious symbolism and designed not as tools of power, but as offerings. To his supporters, Henry's piety was endearing. To his enemies, it was maddening. And in truth, it may have cost him the crown. As rival factions rose, particularly the Yorkists, Henry's absence, both literal and psychological, left power vacuums that others were only too happy to fill. The Wars of the Roses didn't start because Henry prayed too much, but his inability to intervene decisively gave them room to erupt. At times, his fixation on religious rituals was so intense that he appeared to forget he was a king at all. There were reports of him falling into long silences, meditating for hours, while rebellion stirred outside the palace walls. Some even claimed he experienced divine trances, moments where he stood motionless, eyes unfocused, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. Whether these were genuine spiritual episodes or signs of mental illness remains debated, but what's undeniable is that Henry turned to pilgrimage with a desperation that suggested he was seeking more than salvation. He was seeking answers, guidance, perhaps even escape. In the end, Henry's addiction to pilgrimage left him isolated, vulnerable, and tragically ill-suited to the brutal chessboard of 15th century politics. He was captured, restored, deposed again, and ultimately confined. A king who had walked countless miles in search of God and yet found himself caged by men. His story is not one of failure exactly, but of misalignment. A monarch born for a monastery, not a battlefield. A soul more comfortable with candles than with crowns. And yet, not all kings who fled the court turned toward the sacred. One would take refuge in fields instead, trading scepters for shovels, debates for dirt, and royal pronouncements for weather reports. An English monarch who didn't want to reign over peasants so much as join them. 8. George III. Agricultural experiments. George III was called many things during his long reign: madman, tyrant, farmer. The first two stuck for reasons tangled in revolution and rumour, but the third, that one he earned. Unlike his predecessors, who sought power through war, ceremony, or divine performance, George sought it through wheat yields, through compost experiments, through the careful study of livestock anatomy. He was, by all appearances, addicted to farming. Not farming in the aesthetic pastoral painting sense, not the kind where nobles keep quaint little estates and occasionally glance at a ledger. George III didn't play at farming, he lived it, obsessed over it. He read treatises on crop rotation the way other monarchs read dispatches from generals. He considered manure varieties with the gravity of a theologian parsing scripture. And when his advisors asked about foreign threats or political instability, he'd frequently respond with something about turnips. They called him Farmer George, at first with affection, then with mild ridicule, and eventually with a kind of national confusion. Because here was the King of Great Britain, defender of the faith, ruler of the waves, personally tending to soil pH and instructing gardeners on how to graft apple trees. Not just for show either. He was known to walk the fields, boots muddied, notebook in hand, discussing seed germination with alarming specificity. And he loved it. He couldn't stop. From his private estates at Kew and Windsor, George turned his royal residences into experimental farms. He introduced new ploughing methods, tested animal breeding techniques, and even corresponded with agricultural reformers across Europe. His library contained more books on botany than on politics. In fact, the Board of Agriculture was largely his brainchild, a government body formed under his encouragement to spread modern farming techniques throughout Britain. To George, this wasn't a hobby, it was a mission. He believed deeply that the prosperity of the kingdom was tied to the productivity of its land. If England's fields thrived, then so would its people. And if its people thrived, then perhaps, just perhaps, the chaos of the world would soften, because chaos was closing in. While George studied crop yield, colonies were slipping away. The American Revolution brewed and boiled and finally exploded. France followed suit not long after. Britain's empire was beginning to wobble, and yet George, even during wartime, would often shift focus back to farming reports. There was something therapeutic, almost meditative about it. While the world bent and fractured, plants still grew. Cows still needed milking. The earth, unlike Parliament, did not talk back. Critics, of course, were less generous. They accused him of neglect, of fiddling with carrots while London burned, of being so enchanted by fertilizer that he failed to see revolution rising on two continents. And there was truth to that. George's fixation on agriculture, though sincere, often came at the cost of attentiveness to more pressing matters. But for a king overwhelmed by global unrest, perhaps the controlled logic of farming was a form of survival. It's worth noting that George was not insane, not yet anyway, during the height of his agricultural obsession. This came during the middle decades of his reign, when he was still very much in command, still able to spar with ministers and lecture his sons with weary disappointment. But the seeds of something deeper were already present, because what he sought in agriculture was more than food. He sought order, predictability, a world where inputs matched outputs, where toil produced fruit, where rules could be written in soil and sunlight. This was not the realm of politics or diplomacy. It was something cleaner, older, quieter. And when his mind did begin to falter, when the famed madness emerged in full and the regency loomed, it was the farm that still comforted him. Even during his episodes, he was known to babble about crops, to return in his mind to the fields where things still made sense. George III may be remembered for the empire he lost, but in his own estimation, he might have preferred to be remembered for the fields he tended, the animals he bred, the systems he tried in vain to bring to perfection. But not all kings sought control through planting. Some, quite the opposite, were addicted to throwing away royal dignity altogether, abandoning palaces for ditches, gold for gravel, and royal robes for brick dust. One monarch found irresistible joy not in ruling over manual labourers, but in becoming one. 9. Edward II, bricklaying and manual labour. Edward II had a habit of walking away from his crown, not metaphorically, literally. He would vanish from court for hours, sometimes days, leaving behind ministers in a state of mild panic, only to be found ankle-deep in mud, sleeves rolled, happily stacking bricks or digging trenches with local workmen. It wasn't a hobby, it was an addiction. A monarch compulsively drawn to the grime and grind of manual labour, with all the delight of a child discovering the world's first shovel. For a medieval king expected to embody majesty, restraint, and the vague shimmer of divine authority, this was not merely odd, it was scandalous. His contemporaries didn't know what to make of him. Kings were supposed to build kingdoms, not chimneys. But Edward, for all his flaws, and there were many, had a genuine, almost innocent fascination with working-class life. He spent his reign drifting between crises and construction sites. When he wasn't being undermined by nobles or outmaneuvered by his wife, he was laying bricks at Westminster or helping repair dikes in the fens. It wasn't political theatre. He rarely told anyone he was going. He just liked it. According to chroniclers, he would dress down in rough-spun tunics, sometimes indistinguishable from the common labourers around him. He joined their conversations, ate their food, worked beside them, not as a lord inspecting progress, but as a participant, someone who genuinely wanted to understand how walls were raised and why lime mortar hardened the way it did. And for the nobles, this was a nightmare. Edward II's addiction to labour wasn't just eccentric, it was humiliating. His absence from court meetings was interpreted as dereliction. His closeness with tradesmen was viewed as dangerous. The aristocracy feared what it meant to have a king who seemed more comfortable with carpenters than courtiers. He was fraternizing with the wrong kind of people, men with calloused hands and no titles, men who couldn't be controlled with flattery or fear. In truth, Edward's bond with the working class likely began as escapism. His reign was a mess. Political factions tore through court like wolves through a sheepfold. He was constantly at odds with the barons, and his personal relationships, particularly with favourites like Piers Gaveston, invited endless scrutiny, suspicion, and outright rebellion. Royal power, which was supposed to be absolute, felt tenuous in his hands. So he did what many overwhelmed people do. He found something simple, tangible, and controllable. Manual labor offered what politics could not. It had clear rules. You dig, you build, you finish. There was no scheming in a trench, no betrayals in a wheelbarrow, and for a man born into the suffocating architecture of royalty, the open air of a worksite must have felt like freedom. It's not that Edward didn't understand kingship, he just didn't enjoy it. He was raised in the shadow of his father, Edward I, a towering figure of war, law, and expansion. The elder Edward was everything his son was not: decisive, intimidating, respected. In contrast, Edward II was sensitive, erratic, and allergic to the performance of power. Where his father rode into battle, Edward preferred festivals. Where Edward I passed strict statutes, his son passed time with fishermen, masons, and porters. One of the more enduring tales involves Edward joining a group of bricklayers repairing a church wall, not supervising, working. He was said to be cheerful, focused, and entirely uninterested in the bishop who arrived later to complain about the king's absence from council. Edward didn't care. He was already halfway through learning how to lay a perfect corner joint. But addictions, however pure in intent, have consequences. Edward's affinity for commoners didn't endear him to the powerful. His perceived neglect of royal duties became ammunition for his enemies. Eventually, his unorthodox behavior, combined with military failure, fiscal mismanagement, and disastrous political choices, led to rebellion. His own wife, Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, led a coup. Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. It's a bitter irony. The king, who preferred ditches to thrones, was, in the end, stripped of both. Still, there's something oddly modern about him, a royal who saw dignity in labor, who broke class boundaries not with revolution, but with curiosity, who treated peasants not as subjects, but as peers. He didn't want to rise above the kingdom, he wanted to blend into it. But not all addictions were humble. Some kings, like Edward's distant relative Henry VIII, couldn't resist turning basic needs into gladiatorial spectacle. One such need? Eating. And when Henry indulged, he didn't just dine, he conquered the table. 10. Henry VIII. Feasting competitions. Henry VIII never did anything halfway. Not ruling, not romancing, not dismantling the Catholic Church, and certainly not eating. To say Henry had an appetite is to say the Thames is damp. It's technically correct, but wildly inadequate. He didn't just love food, he turned eating into theatre, into ritual, into open competition. Feasting for Henry was never just about sustenance, it was about dominance, and somewhere along the way it became an addiction, not to food alone, but to the act of winning at food. Henry VIII was obsessed with competitive feasting. He turned banquets into battlegrounds. He wanted to out-eat his nobles, outdrink visiting dignitaries, and outlast the stomachs of lesser men. The table was just another throne, and Henry intended to sit atop it with the same brute charisma he brought to every other aspect of his chaotic reign. It began with the sheer scale of his banquets. Meals at Henry's court weren't just large, they were geological events. A typical feast could include dozens of courses: roasted boar, whole swans, peacocks with their feathers reattached after cooking, a grotesque display of culinary taxidermy, intricately molded jellies, sugar sculptures, entire pies that bled fruit or meat, or occasionally other pies, and always an audience. Because Henry didn't just eat, he performed eating. He demanded his nobles feast alongside him and then made sport of beating them, plate after plate, goblet after goblet. The subtext was always clear. If you couldn't keep up, you didn't belong at the king's table. There are accounts of him goading courtiers into overindulgence, daring them to match him bite for bite, knowing full well that no one could or should compete. But they did. because to refuse was to insult the king, to beat him was unwise, and to try and fail was, well, normal, which in Tudor England was a dangerous thing to be. There's a disturbing clarity to how Henry used food. It wasn't gluttony in the passive, lazy sense. It was conquest. He treated meals like war games, strategic, excessive, and meant to prove a point. Just as he bent the church to his will, Henry bent the very notion of appetite. He wasn't content to enjoy a good roast. He wanted to defeat it. And as with all compulsions, the pleasure slowly warped into necessity. Over the years, his banquets grew more elaborate, his portions larger, his weight ballooned, his health deteriorated. But the feasting didn't stop. On the contrary, it accelerated, even when his legs could barely support him. When ulcers made walking agonizing, Henry continued to host and devour great feasts. He would have food brought to him on silver platters while he sat in reinforced chairs, still lording over the table like an emperor of excess. And yet, despite the theatricality, there was something deeply human at the center of it all. Henry's compulsive feasting wasn't just vanity or sadism, it was a coping mechanism. As his reign grew darker, more violent, and more uncertain, the dining hall remained one of the few places where he could still assert control. Here, at least, he was master of the game. The rules were his, the consequences were edible. It's no coincidence that his most intense periods of feasting followed major upheavals. Divorces, rebellions, betrayals. The man who had split a continent over his desire for an heir often found comfort not in love nor legacy, but in the endless promise of a laden table. Food became a form of reassurance, an empire that could be consumed, a kingdom reduced to manageable bites, and everyone else had to play along. But Henry's addiction to competitive feasting wasn't his only compulsive vanity. The same man who sought to out-eat his court also sought to outdress it, and his descendant, George IV, would take that impulse to new and glittering extremes, transforming fashion from an indulgence into an identity crisis with tailor's shears. 11. George IV, extreme clothes and tailoring. George IV didn't just wear clothes, he inhabited them. Draped himself in them like armor, like myth, like a desperate denial of the mirror. While some kings measured their greatness in battles won or policies passed, George measured his in inches of embroidery and hours spent before the tailor's mirror. His addiction to fashion wasn't vanity, it was identity construction, and it consumed him. This was a monarch who once ordered over 50 pairs of trousers in a single sitting, not because he needed them, but because the idea of not having the perfect cut for every conceivable occasion filled him with a strange existential dread. George wasn't merely addicted to fine clothes. He was addicted to reinventing himself through them, daily, compulsively, and at great cost to the treasury, and to his own self-esteem. Even before ascending to the throne, George, as Prince of Wales, had already earned a reputation across Europe for his dazzling, sometimes absurd, sartorial excesses. He idolized Beau Brummel, the original dandy and his one-time close friend, who introduced the prince to the gospel of perfect fit, restrained extravagance, and the painstaking effort of appearing effortlessly elegant. At first, George followed Brummel's rules, but eventually, as with all things in his life, he took them to unnecessary operatic extremes. Multiple outfit changes a day became the norm. Morning coats, riding habits, diplomatic uniforms, heavily brocaded waistcoats, jewel-encrusted slippers for lounging indoors. It didn't matter if the garments were functional, comfortable, or flattering. They had to be perfect. More than perfect. They had to distract, overpower, reshape the narrative. As George's body grew, bulked by overindulgence, slowed by illness, puffed by insecurity, his tailoring rituals grew more elaborate. His obsession wasn't really with fashion itself, but with control. If he could manipulate the external, the cut, the fabric, the illusion, Perhaps he could silence the inner monologue that whispered he was not loved, not respected, not remembered as he wished to be. He would spend hours being measured, not minutes, hours, dozens of fittings, dozens of tailors, constant complaints, minor adjustments, dramatic gestures. There are accounts of George throwing temper tantrums over a misaligned buttonhole, or demanding that a court uniform be entirely remade because the silver thread was too loud, and yet, paradoxically, he was also deeply insecure about the result. Once, he reportedly asked his valet if he looked slimmer in one of his new ceremonial jackets. The valet, reluctant but honest, hesitated too long. George dismissed him on the spot. This, of course, came at a price, not just financially, though his clothing budget was eye-watering even by royal standards, but politically. While Britain struggled with economic uncertainty in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, George was spending public funds on new cravats and gilded shoehorns. Satirists had a field day. He became a living cartoon in the press, bloated, perfumed, draped in silks and self-delusion. But George didn't stop, couldn't stop, because to stop dressing was to be seen. And George, despite his theatricality, feared that more than anything. Clothes were his curtain. Behind them, he was safe, or at least protected by the illusion of sovereignty. By the time he became king in 1820, his wardrobe was said to include thousands of garments, many of which he never wore. They sat, folded and catalogued like mute evidence of a man trying to stitch together a version of himself the world might finally approve of. But the more he sewed, the less real he became. In the end, George IV didn't wear clothes to express himself. He wore them to hide himself. Every coat, every polished boot, every over-tailored frock was another layer of insulation from the disapproval he couldn't bear to face directly. Fashion was the stage. He was the illusion. But some monarchs were addicted to real illusions, strange experiments, unnatural sciences, and the belief that mystery itself could be tamed. One king turned his court into a laboratory and treated his reign like a controlled experiment, blurring the line between monarchy and alchemy. 12. Charles II. Scientific experiments. Charles II never quite trusted stability, and perhaps with good reason. He was born into a monarchy that collapsed, lived in exile across war-torn Europe, and returned to the throne only after England had tried life without kings and promptly decided that maybe decapitation wasn't the best long-term strategy. You could say Charles ruled with a survivor's instinct, smiling, charming, always a few steps ahead of chaos. But behind that breezy exterior was a mind addicted to something stranger than power. Science. Not the respectable, slow-moving science of textbooks and telescopes. Charles was addicted to curiosity at its most unhinged. He liked his experiments chaotic, unpredictable, and preferably happening right in front of him. His court at times felt less like a palace and more like a laboratory with slightly better furniture. It began, as most addictions do, innocently enough. Charles had been influenced by his years abroad, particularly in France and the Dutch Republic, where natural philosophy, the forerunner of science, was gaining ground. When he returned to England in 1660, so did the monarchy, and with it came Charles's personal passion project, turning curiosity into a royal virtue. Within months of his restoration, Charles chartered the Royal Society, a group of gentlemen committed to the advancement of scientific knowledge. But this wasn't just a figurehead gesture. Charles attended meetings. He participated in discussions. He asked questions that ranged from inspired to baffling. He took the pursuit of knowledge personally and at times obsessively. What separated Charles from other monarchs wasn't that he funded science, it's that he wanted in. He wanted to see things explode. He wanted to know how mercury moved, how magnets worked, what happened when you put strange liquids together and waited. He wasn't content to rule the country. He wanted to understand how its atoms stuck together. His obsession ranged wide. He watched dissections with clinical interest, once inviting court members to observe the anatomy of a porpoise washed ashore on the Thames. He personally kept dogs, cats, and pigeons as test subjects for minor medical experiments, not in cruelty, but in sincere inquiry. He once demanded a demonstration of how a vacuum pump worked, and when it succeeded, declared it a most miraculous device, and immediately asked what else it could suck the air from. Charles's interest extended to chemistry, mechanics, medicine, and even timekeeping. He patronized Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, and Isaac Newton, all early scientific giants who needed royal funding, and found in Charles a king who didn't just nod approvingly, but genuinely wanted to know what they'd discovered this week. And it wasn't all theoretical. Charles commissioned the rebuilding of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, instructing astronomers to help solve the problem of measuring longitude. At sea, a logistical nightmare that cost ships and lives. He consulted doctors about the circulation of blood and demanded demonstrations of transfusions between animals. When one scientist claimed he could weigh air, Charles didn't just ask for a report, he wanted the scales brought to court. To outsiders, this seemed eccentric, even dangerous. The line between curiosity and recklessness was thin, and Charles tiptoed it daily. Some ministers grumbled that the king was more interested in telescopes than treaties. Foreign ambassadors were confused when summoned to an audience and instead found themselves watching chemical reactions with the king and a court physician. One could imagine them taking notes, thinking, "Does your king perform acid-base reactions before breakfast?" But underneath the deadpan absurdity was a clear pattern. Charles was addicted to knowledge that bent the world. Knowledge that explained things. After a lifetime of exile, betrayal, and religious bloodshed, science offered a kind of purity. It didn't lie, it didn't conspire, it just revealed. And yet, like all royal obsessions, there was a performative edge. Charles knew that science, like religion or monarchy, required spectacle, so he staged it, promoted it, turned his court into a salon of discovery. To be clever in Charles's England was suddenly fashionable, at least for men. Women, as always, were politely excluded from the lab. Still, this obsession with experimentation left its mark. The Royal Society became one of the most respected scientific institutions in the world. The groundwork laid under Charles helped define the Enlightenment. And for all his failures, of which there were many, Charles left behind a kingdom a little more curious, a little less superstitious. Of course, not every monarch channeled their compulsions into intellectual pursuits. One of Charles's descendants would trade microscopes for horse racing tickets, equations for odds, and noble inquiries for the intoxicating thrill of the bet. His addiction wasn't to knowledge, it was to risk. 13. Edward VII. Gambling and horse racing. Edward VII never pretended to be a philosopher king. He wasn't interested in theology, science, or the moral dilemmas of empire. What he wanted, what he lived for, was motion. Social motion, political motion, and above all, the heart-pounding, purse-emptying spectacle of horses hurtling down a racetrack with thousands of pounds and reputations riding on every thunderous hoofbeat. While his mother, Queen Victoria, spent decades ensconced in mourning and moralism, Edward spent his life in pursuit of distraction, and he found his most enduring, expensive and compulsive distraction in gambling, specifically betting on horse racing. It wasn't just a pastime, it was a need. From his early years as Prince of Wales, Edward displayed an almost supernatural talent for avoiding the responsibilities of monarchy. He perfected the art of showing up precisely when needed, bowing just low enough, smiling just long enough, and then disappearing into a haze of brandy, cigars, and betting slips. The turf, meaning the racetrack, not the monarchy, was where he felt most at home, and gambling became his unofficial portfolio. It started in his 20s, during a time when polite society still clung to the idea that wagering was a gentleman's indulgence. Edward pushed that boundary hard. While other aristocrats placed discreet bets in private clubs, Edward made a show of it. He attended the races not as a distant royal figurehead, but as a central player. He didn't just watch, he competed. He owned horses, managed stables, cultivated connections with jockeys, and followed form guides like sacred texts. And he bet, constantly, lavishly, often recklessly. There are accounts of Edward wagering staggering sums on races, sometimes across multiple horses in the same event, hedging his emotional investments like a seasoned financier, but with the strategic subtlety of a cannonball. Losing didn't seem to deter him. Winning didn't satisfy him. What he craved was the rush, the moment before the gate dropped, the electricity of uncertainty, the delicious agony of risk. It was well known in court circles that if you wanted to talk to the Prince of Wales about foreign policy, you'd best start with horse odds. His conversations, even in Parliament-adjacent spaces, would veer toward the day's racing cards. Ambassadors learned to study pedigrees. Dukes whispered tips. Cabinet ministers nervously consulted stable reports before daring to broach trade agreements. His love of racing extended beyond the betting ring. Edward was intimately involved in the sport's logistics. He frequented stables, personally oversaw breeding programs, and kept meticulous records on his favorite horses. He knew their temperaments, their strengths, their weaknesses. He wasn't just a royal spectator, he was a full-fledged racing strategist, albeit one prone to indulging his instincts over sound arithmetic. And this was, of course, expensive. Edward's financial situation was perpetually delicate, despite being the heir to one of the world's wealthiest thrones. His debts, racked up from gambling, entertaining, and a taste for luxury that bordered on compulsive, became something of a diplomatic concern. Parliament, weary of funding his lifestyle, routinely refused to bail him out. So Edward got creative, leaning on wealthy friends, taking loans that were never repaid, and forming informal networks of elite gamblers who helped cushion his losses. But the addiction wasn't just about money, it was about status. Horse racing in Edward's England was a currency of social capital. To own a champion steed, to be seen in the royal box at Ascot, to place a bold bet and pretend not to care about the outcome, these were acts of cultural power, and Edward wielded them masterfully. The British public, for all their grumbling about his indulgences, found themselves strangely enchanted. Edward was a king-in-waiting who seemed allergic to governance, but remarkably gifted at charm. He made monarchy feel less austere, more human, and his gambling, though reckless, gave him a connection to the thrill-seeking, pleasure-hunting public who also liked a good flutter on race day. Still, the consequences caught up with him. By the time he became king in 1901, Edward was 60 and physically worn. Years of excess, gambling included, had dulled his energy. The thrill had faded, but the habits remained. He continued to wager, though with less visible excitement, as if chasing a high that no longer quite delivered. And yet he couldn't stop. Because for Edward VII, gambling wasn't a phase or even a vice. It was how he understood the world. Unpredictable, performative, ruled by odds and instinct. And while he reigned with surprising competence for 9 short years, the racetrack remained the one place where he felt truly alive. Just another man with a ticket, a hunch, and everything to lose. But not all kings chased adrenaline through horses and betting slips. One monarch returned again and again to the medieval theatre of combat. Not with armies, but with armor, lances, and the relentless need to prove his worth by nearly killing himself in front of an audience. 14. Henry VIII, Jousting and Risk. For Henry VIII, risk wasn't something to be managed, it was something to be conquered, flaunted, and then repeated until bones broke. His appetite for danger didn't reside in the battlefield, where generals could absorb the consequences, or in politics, where risks could be softened with diplomacy. No, Henry's most dangerous addiction lived in the gleaming spectacle of the tournament grounds. He was, quite simply, addicted to jousting, not recreationally, not symbolically, but compulsively. And in a time when monarchs were expected to embody martial glory while ideally staying alive long enough to pass on a stable lineage, Henry's addiction to mounting a horse, lowering a lance, and galloping headlong at another armoured man with a wooden spear was more than a quirk. It was a royal liability dressed in chivalric nostalgia. From his youth, Henry was enamoured with the image of the ideal knight. He read Arthurian romances obsessively, styled himself as a second coming of King Arthur, and recreated the myths of Camelot with all the resources of a royal treasury. But unlike other kings who were content to host tournaments and watch from the safety of a velvet-draped pavilion, Henry insisted on competing, again and again, loudly, proudly, sometimes recklessly. He didn't just love jousting, he needed it. To Henry, each tilt was a declaration of strength, of masculinity, of divine favour. In a world of shifting alliances, fragile bloodlines, and courtly scheming, the tournament ground offered something pure. There were rules, there were winners and losers, and in the middle of it all was Henry, covered in gilt armour, ready to split another noble off his horse. And he was good at it, or at least, early in his reign, people said he was. Accounts from the early 1500s paint Henry as the image of martial royalty, tall, broad-shouldered, athletic, with boundless energy and a flair for spectacle. His tournaments were extravagant affairs, staged with theatrical precision and always focused on making Henry look like a conquering hero. He would ride into the arena beneath banners embroidered with Tudor roses and flaming hearts. Trumpets blared, courtiers wept, poets wrote about the glint in his eye. But the deeper truth was more troubling. Henry couldn't stop. Even as he aged, even as the risks mounted, even after serious injuries, he returned to the lists again and again. A man addicted not just to the sport, but to the symbolic certainty it gave him. Unlike diplomacy, jousting had an outcome. You either broke a lance or you didn't. You were either thrown or you stood tall. No ambiguities, no paperwork, just impact. That hunger for certainty may explain why he kept riding even when his body begged him not to. His first serious injury came in 1524, when he took a lance to the face. Yes, the face, because he forgot to lower his visor. The lance splintered, shards pierced his brow, and the court collectively gasped. But Henry waved it off. He didn't stop. If anything, he doubled down. Over the next decade, his injuries mounted. So did the whispers. By the 1530s, Henry was no longer the Golden Prince. He was heavier, slower, prone to mood swings, and yet he still suited up for tournaments, still hurled himself into contests of force that even his doctors began to caution against. He ignored them, because the danger, the sheer madness of it, was the point. In 1536, everything changed. During a jousting match at Greenwich, Henry was unhorsed. He fell violently. Some sources claim his fully armoured body lay unconscious for hours. The blow was catastrophic. He suffered internal injuries. His leg never fully healed. The injury festered for years, turning every step into agony. It marked a before and after, not just in his health, but in his rule. The man who once galloped for glory now limped in rage. He became more paranoid, more brutal, more erratic. And yet, even after this near-fatal accident, Henry still spoke of tournaments, still indulged in mock games, still lived in the fantasy of chivalric pageantry, because he couldn't let go. Jousting was the one arena where he felt invincible, where he didn't have to negotiate, justify, or explain himself. It was pure performance. It was identity. And losing that stage meant confronting a body and a legacy that no longer obeyed him. In time, the image of Henry the Gallant gave way to Henry the Tyrant. But somewhere beneath the layers of velvet and pain, there remained a flicker of the young knight who once believed he could shape destiny with a well-aimed lance. And while Henry's addiction to risk left scars on his body, another monarch found obsession in something quieter, more delicate, an empire not of force, but of gears. A king who believed that if he could just listen closely enough to the ticking of time, he might hear order in the chaos. 15. George III. Clock collecting. George III spent much of his life trying to make sense of things, kingdoms, families, revolutions, his own mind. But nothing, not Parliament, not America, not even his children, ever quite did what he wanted them to. Except for clocks. Clocks at least could be understood. They followed rules. They ticked when they should. They chimed when they must. And for a king slowly unraveling beneath the weight of history, duty, and mental deterioration, that predictability was irresistible. George didn't just collect clocks, he retreated into them. It was less a hobby, more a sanctuary of precision. By the late 18th century, George III had quietly amassed one of the most intricate and obsessive private collections of timepieces in royal history. Not grandstanding palace centerpieces meant to awe guests, but delicate, finely tuned instruments, many handmade, many modified by the king himself. He surrounded himself with clocks the way others surrounded themselves with advisors, and unlike the latter, clocks didn't argue. It began, as most royal eccentricities do, innocently enough. A gift here, a fascination there. George had always been curious about mechanics. He was intrigued by the way small parts could come together to create something larger, something synchronized. Unlike human institutions, machines worked. The escapement wheel didn't rebel. The pendulum didn't gossip. A well-kept clock didn't break laws, question the monarchy, or try to declare independence. At Kew Palace, Windsor, and Buckingham House, rooms filled with clocks ticked with hypnotic rhythm. They were of every size and type: mantle clocks, bracket clocks, long case clocks, even miniature pocket watches he rarely used but kept anyway. Some rooms reportedly contained dozens of them, each synchronized meticulously. George would check them personally. He was said to walk from one clock to the next, listening, adjusting, waiting for irregularities. A monarch in motion, trying to hold time still. He also commissioned timepieces built to custom specifications, often from the finest horologists in Europe. John Ellicott and Vulliamy, two of the era's leading clockmakers, both served George directly, supplying him with intricate mechanisms he studied like sacred texts. But he didn't just admire the external beauty of a well-made clock. He wanted to know how they worked. He would remove backs, dismantle components, make notes, then request the same clock again in a different variation. Some accounts suggest he kept detailed diagrams of internal layouts, cross-referencing them with handwritten calculations about rate drift and gear ratios. This was not a man with a casual interest in timekeeping. This was a man seeking order. And you can't blame him. George's reign was beset by disorder. The American colonies broke away, leaving the monarchy bruised and embarrassed. Political factions tore through Parliament like competing wolves. His own sons rebelled against him with the same fervour that George himself had once feared from France. And underlying it all was his increasingly fragile mind, subject to breakdowns, manic episodes, and periods of incoherence that terrified the court and, on some level, likely terrified George himself. But clocks did not betray him. They were quiet companions. They stayed put. They told him that the world still moved forward, even if nothing else seemed to. There's something deeply human and quietly tragic in that image. A king pacing a room of ticking mechanisms, adjusting minute hands with surgical attention, trying to prove that something, anything, was still within his control. Because time, unlike empires, didn't rebel. It marched on, reliable, ruthless, unsentimental. And yet, despite his fixation, George never really escaped time's grasp. As the years passed and his health declined, so did the king's ability to interact with the world he once tried to regulate. His final years were spent in seclusion, blind and increasingly disconnected, reportedly still surrounded by the quiet ticking of his beloved clocks. It was as though he hoped they would hold him together, and maybe they did, at least for a while. But even the most finely tuned timepiece can't hold back the inevitable. Still, George's addiction to order through ticking brass and polished mahogany stands in stark contrast to another monarch's addiction to the shimmering chaos of luxury. Where George tried to contain the world within gears, a certain Tudor queen tried to decorate it instead, adorning herself with enough jewels to blind an ambassador and silence a court with nothing but a well-placed ruby. 16. Elizabeth I, jewelry and gems. Elizabeth I didn't merely wear jewels, she weaponized them. Rubies were not ornaments, they were declarations. Pearls were not accessories, they were public relations. Every jewel on her body served a purpose, and every piece of gold she wore was charged with meaning, myth, and unspoken messages. But beneath the royal dazzle was something more compulsive, an addiction to collecting, possessing, and flaunting gemstones with a hunger that bordered on the unhinged. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth had accumulated what was possibly the most elaborate personal jewelry collection in English royal history, and that wasn't by accident. It was by design, by obsession, by an increasingly uncontrollable compulsion to be not just queen, but living iconography. Elizabeth didn't just want to rule, she wanted to be remembered as an immortal, glittering legend who could silence a room with the light bouncing off her bodice. Even in portraits, her addiction to jewels is hard to ignore. The Armada portrait, painted after England's defeat of the Spanish fleet in 1588, shows Elizabeth surrounded by naval imagery. Yes, but what dominates the frame are ropes of pearls, golden embellishments, jeweled embroidery, and gemstones so densely packed they threaten to collapse the very idea of tasteful. She appears less like a monarch and more like a chandelier that's learned to talk. Pearls, in particular, became her signature. They symbolized purity, an image Elizabeth leaned on heavily in her construction of the Virgin Queen mythology. But her relationship with them went well beyond symbolism. She layered them endlessly, around her neck, in her hair, sewn into her gowns, dangling from earrings and girdles. One courtier remarked that she seemed to float in white light. Another privately wondered how she managed to walk under the weight of it all. The answer? She didn't care. The more, the better. The more visible, the more powerful. And she didn't stop with pearls. Her collection included sapphires, emeralds, diamonds, spinels, garnets, and opals. Some gifted, many acquired, and others forcibly donated by subjects eager to stay in her good graces. Elizabeth's appetite for jewelry was so infamous that foreign dignitaries came prepared with gemstones instead of treaties. They knew that a ruby might be worth more than a speech, and they were right. She expected jewels for every occasion, birthdays, New Year's, even military victories that had nothing to do with her. Her courtiers were practically bled dry by the expectation of providing lavish gifts just to be seen, heard, or, if they were very lucky, forgiven. And Elizabeth never forgot a gem. She remembered who gave what and when. Failing to gift her something dazzling could quietly end a career. A well-timed sapphire, however, might launch one. And it wasn't just receiving jewelry. She curated it, catalogued it, inventoried it down. To the clasp, Elizabeth had an almost forensic relationship with her collection. She took stock of every piece, ordered repairs, and designed custom mounts and settings to modernize older heirlooms. Jewels weren't stagnant, they were living pieces of propaganda. But the obsession had darker edges. As she aged and her physical appearance began to betray time's slow, cruel progress, Elizabeth's jewelry grew heavier, more elaborate, more theatrical. Her gowns became stiffer with embellishment, her collars wider, her bodices more encrusted. She tried to outshine age itself, to bury time under a mountain of gold and light. There are reports from her later years of private audiences where Elizabeth would appear under heavy layers of brocade and gemstones, barely able to move, her skin powdered white and her jewels glowing like shields. Courtiers would bow, compliment her radiance, and then whisper about how long it took her to walk from one end of the room to the other. But still, she wore them every day, to meals, to council, to private prayers. Because the jewels weren't just decorations, they were armor in a court filled with spies, conspiracies, and endless reminders that her reign was always one crisis away from collapse. The one thing Elizabeth could control completely was her appearance. If she looked eternal, untouchable, divine, then maybe she would be. Her addiction to jewels wasn't just about beauty, it was about survival. A message to the world that she was not to be underestimated, pitied, or forgotten. Her court might age, her alliances might crumble, her health might falter, but her sparkle would remain blinding. But not every monarch found power in radiance. One would flee into the woods instead, chasing beasts on horseback with such relentless intensity that even ministers began to wonder if he loved governance half as much as he loved the kill. 17. James I, hunting frenzy. For James I, King of England and Scotland, governance was tolerable, writing was therapeutic, and religion was essential, but hunting was everything. Not a pastime, not a royal formality, a need, an addiction, a deep and unrelenting compulsion to chase, kill, and control the wild things of the world, preferably from horseback, preferably with dogs, and preferably while ignoring absolutely everything else that demanded his attention. He called it the noblest exercise, and by the end of his reign, there were few who dared challenge the claim, because James had structured entire stretches of his kingship around the hunt. Parliaments were delayed for it. State matters were interrupted by it. Foreign envoys were kept waiting while he galloped through forests after stags, pheasants, or boars. If politics was an obligation, hunting was salvation. James's love for the hunt didn't emerge from idle curiosity. It was part of his childhood mythology. Born in Scotland in 1566 to Mary, Queen of Scots, and raised amid the blood-soaked turbulence of dynastic uncertainty, James grew up with two things: chronic anxiety and a deeply rooted belief that the natural world could be subdued with ritual and dominance. Hunting gave him both a distraction and a framework. It became the first thing in his life he could reliably master, and once he had power, he never looked back. The scale of his hunting operation was staggering. Royal parks across England were maintained not for their beauty or serenity, but for their utility as animal pens. Thousands of acres of royal land were managed like private game reserves. Deer were imported. Wild boars were bred. Trees were planted not for shade, but for chase routes. Entire villages were relocated to improve the course of a hunting ground. Hunting wasn't a day's entertainment for James, it was infrastructure. He would ride out for hours, sometimes dawn to dusk, in pursuit of quarry. Not always successfully. But for James, the kill was secondary. What mattered was the chase, the ritual, the roaring of hounds, the pulse of hooves, the theatre of being in motion with a purpose only he could define. When ministers tried to catch him for council business, he'd vanish into the woods. When Queen Anne, his wife, attempted to discuss family matters, James often responded with, "Not now, I ride." One court observer famously remarked that His Majesty doth govern by gallop. Another called him a king always slightly out of breath. Even his writings show the influence. James authored several books, including Basilicon Doron and Daemonology, both of which include extended metaphors about hunting, beasts, and the mastery of chaos. He wrote as a man who believed nature, whether moral or animal, could be chased into submission. The universe, to James, was a forest of threats, and he was determined to hunt them all down. But as with many royal compulsions, there was a darker layer. James wasn't simply in love with hunting, he was addicted to its illusion of control. His political instincts were erratic. His court was full of schemers. He oscillated between paranoia and indifference. But in the woods, there were no debates, no advisors, no conspiracies, just targets, just beasts that ran and dogs that obeyed. This psychological dimension explains why he insisted on leading the chase himself, even as he aged, even as the terrain grew dangerous. Falls from horseback were frequent. His attendants were constantly tasked with keeping him from injuring himself. Still, he refused to ride passively. He had to be in front, always. Even when his stamina failed him, his obsession pushed him forward, and when he wasn't physically hunting, he was planning for it. He kept charts of animal movements, logs of previous hunts, correspondence with gamekeepers and wardens. His wardrobe was filled with custom-made hunting attire. His personal dogs were bred for speed and discipline, and many had names more carefully chosen than those of his lesser nobles. This relentless hunting life didn't just define James, it shaped the very image of monarchy under his rule. Courtiers quickly learned that if they wanted to gain favor, they needed to learn the language of the hunt. The most successful statesmen of his reign weren't necessarily the most intelligent, but the most willing to ride alongside him, to share the silence between gallops, to pretend that chasing a stag was equivalent to ruling a state. And for James, perhaps it was, because the hunt, unlike the court, was predictable. The dogs followed commands, the horses ran where directed, and in the moment just before the final strike, James could feel, for a few seconds, like the world was perfectly in order. But while he sought power in motion, another king found it in stillness. In paintings, in collecting beauty with the same intensity others reserved for battle. A monarch whose true battlefield was the auction house, and whose enemies were anyone who dared outbid him for a Caravaggio. 18. Charles I. Art collecting. Charles I was a man born into a theatre of power but built for a museum. Reserved where his father, James I, had been erratic, stiff where his peers were theatrical, Charles moved through the rituals of monarchy like a porcelain figurine, carefully arranged, easily broken, and most at ease when surrounded by things that couldn't talk back. He wasn't a warrior king, he wasn't a statesman, he certainly wasn't a man of the people, but Charles was something far rarer in the pantheon of English monarchs. He was an aesthetic addict, and his particular poison, his vice, his fixation, his most compulsive escape was art, specifically collecting it. To say Charles I loved art is to undersell the situation entirely. He didn't just love it, he craved it, he hunted it. He pursued masterpieces with the fervor of a starving man looking for bread, and not for status alone, not to show off at court dinners. Charles collected like a man trying to fill a hole in the world, a hole left by the fact that he could never quite master speech, never truly connect with the people he ruled, never inspire the loyalty that kings were supposed to command by birthright. So he surrounded himself with loyalty in another form. Oil, canvas, gold leaf. It started early, with portraiture. Charles was famously self-conscious about his appearance, small in stature, slight of frame, with a weak chin that no amount of divine right could quite disguise. But paintings could fix that. Enter Sir Anthony van Dyck, the court painter who didn't just flatter the king, he practically mythologized him. In Van Dyck's hands, Charles became a romantic vision of monarchy, elegant, brooding, tall on horseback, with flowing hair and armor that seemed less military than metaphysical. The power of the image became the image of his power. But it wasn't enough to be in art. Charles wanted to own it, all of it. Across his reign, he poured vast sums into acquiring paintings from across Europe. Raphael, Titian, Correggio, Rubens. If it was exquisite and continental, Charles wanted it, and he usually got it. Through a network of agents and diplomats, he snapped up entire collections at once, most famously that of the Gonzaga family of Mantua, a treasure trove of Renaissance art that fell into his hands like divine providence. By the mid-1630s, his collection rivaled that of any monarch in Europe. It numbered in the thousands. Works from Italy, Spain, Flanders. Paintings, tapestries, sculptures, rare books, ornate furniture. He commissioned, he curated, he catalogued, he walked among them like a priest in a private chapel. And yet it never satisfied him, because the art was never just about beauty. It was about control, about order, about a world that made sense. In a painting, kings were calm, landscapes were harmonious, saints glowed, everything had composition, balance and resolution. This was not how his kingdom worked. Charles's actual reign was a mess of rising tensions, miscommunications, and constitutional breakdowns. He didn't understand Parliament. He didn't trust commoners. He didn't have the temperament for consensus. While England asked for reform, for representation, for relief from overreach, Charles responded with another painting. And as tensions escalated towards civil war, Charles withdrew further into his palace of masterpieces. It was escapism, yes, but it was also a delusion. He believed that taste, refinement, and divine order could protect him, that a king who owned a Rubens was too cultured to be overthrown, that a monarch painted so regally must surely be loved. He was not. In 1642, civil war broke out. Parliament versus king. Politics turned to powder and steel, but even in exile, even as his world collapsed, Charles clung to his art. When the parliamentary forces eventually captured him, they seized not just his person, but his collection. And when he was executed in 1649, an unthinkable moment, the first English king put on public trial and sentenced to death, it wasn't just a political regime that ended, it was a gallery shattered. The Commonwealth sold off his collection. Paintings scattered across Europe, priceless works auctioned to pay debts. The great gallery of Charles I became a ruin of receipts and regrets. And yet, the irony lingers. A man so obsessed with preservation of beauty, of image, of monarchy, was undone by the very world he thought his paintings could shield him from. He tried to govern like a curator, but his subjects wanted a king. Still, not all royal obsessions were about collecting the divine. Some were about chasing the ordinary. One of Charles's predecessors found himself compulsively drawn, not to saints or sovereigns, but to commoners, not to elevate them, but to join them. A king who preferred pubs to palaces, and workmen to war councils. 19. Edward II, rustic company. Edward II, son of the iron-fisted Edward I, was born into an empire built on conquest, discipline, and intimidation. His father was a man carved out of battlefield legend and hard legal reforms, famously ruthless, famously effective. Edward II, by contrast, preferred rowing boats with peasants. Literally, he had a disarming tendency to wander off from the burdens of monarchy to spend time with workmen, ditch diggers, carpenters, and fishermen. And while some monarchs sought the glory of mingling with the common folk in staged displays of benevolent rule, Edward's obsession with rustic company wasn't performance. It was preference. It baffled his court. It infuriated his barons. It scandalized chroniclers. But Edward didn't care, because the more time he spent with nobles, the more he longed for people who didn't bow. From the start of his reign, Edward showed an unorthodox disinterest in the traditional roles of kingship. He was famously indifferent to military campaigns, dismissive of the expected rituals of court life, and often absent during high-level political negotiations. Where was the king during key debates on war funding or matters of diplomacy? Building a wall with masons, chatting with shipwrights, hauling stone in the countryside with men who didn't flinch when he opened his mouth. To the aristocracy, this was not just eccentric, it was treasonous to their sense of order. Kings weren't supposed to like the smell of sawdust. They weren't supposed to swap gossip with blacksmiths or laugh too loudly at a Thatcher's joke, but Edward seemed genuinely more comfortable with villagers than with viscounts. He paid generous wages to labourers who worked near him, sat in their gatherings, even ate among them with a sense of quiet joy that never quite appeared when he was in his own council chambers. Contemporary accounts speak, often with disbelief, of the king rowing boats on the Thames with commoners, visiting manors unannounced, and insisting on sleeping rough during royal progresses, not out of some ascetic piety, but because he preferred it. He would show up to construction sites at dawn to inspect foundations and offer unsolicited advice to professional builders who, to their credit, learned to nod politely and accept whatever the king suggested. There was no political logic to it, no strategic outreach or populist agenda. Edward simply gravitated toward people who didn't speak in riddles and power plays, and he returned to them again and again like a man trying to escape his own reflection. It would be tempting to paint this as humility, as the sweet oddity of a king who saw value in all his subjects. But the truth is less romantic. Edward's obsession with rustic company was also a kind of avoidance. He was a man at sea in his own court. His inability to play the political game, especially with the barons who expected a ruler moulded in his father's image, left him isolated, insecure, and desperate for connection that didn't require ceremonial language or hidden daggers. And connection, in the most basic sense, was something he craved. Not pomp, not authority, just belonging. The kind of easy camaraderie that didn't require crowns or titles. A world where nobody addressed him as Your Majesty, and nobody expected him to raise taxes or lead armies or dispense justice. In the tavern or the field, he was just Edward, but that freedom came at a cost. His repeated public preference for low-born companionship eroded the already strained trust between the crown and the nobility. The barons didn't just resent it, they feared it. A monarch who aligned himself socially with commoners might, they feared, one day turn against the aristocracy altogether. Worse, he might empower men like his infamous favourite, Piers Gaveston or Hugh Despenser, not because of their nobility, but because of their loyalty. And loyalty for Edward mattered more than lineage, more than law. It's not that Edward II despised the nobility, he simply didn't know how to operate within their framework. He was ill-suited to the theatrical brutality of court politics. He was too transparent, too emotionally erratic, too soft for a world that required steel. So he drifted, away from his lords, away from his council, into the arms of the people who let him be just another man in the room. Eventually, of course, it caught up with him. His detachment from royal norms, his erratic favoritism, and his increasingly tense relationship with the barons led to rebellion. His wife, Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, seized control. Edward was deposed in 1327, overthrown by the very system he never quite learned to manipulate. Yet despite the chaos and failure of his reign, there remains a haunting poignancy in Edward's compulsion. He didn't want to rule the world. He wanted to retreat from it. He wasn't seeking power. He was trying to disappear into something real. But while Edward sought emotional refuge in the company of commoners, another monarch found comfort in the quiet jingle of coin against coin. A king who trusted no one, not his nobles, not his allies, not even his own blood, except for the mountain of gold he counted and recounted obsessively. 20. Henry VII, hoarding wealth. Henry VII did not hoard wealth in the way misers do, not out of greed, not out of paranoia, not even out of personal indulgence. He hoarded money the way a drowning man hoards air, obsessively, inhalingly, with the sense that if he stopped even for a moment, the entire kingdom, and perhaps his own identity, might collapse. Crowned in the aftermath of civil war, Henry VII ruled with a cold, calculating precision. He was the founder of the Tudor dynasty, but he never felt secure in it. His reign began with blood on the battlefield at Bosworth, where he seized the crown from Richard III, and it never really left that battlefield, at least not in his mind. He treated kingship not as a divine right or romantic quest, but as a delicate, temporary arrangement that could be upended by one bad ledger entry. And so he turned to the only ally he could fully trust: coinage. Henry VII's addiction to wealth wasn't mere frugality. It was a compulsion. He didn't just save, he accumulated, carefully, secretly, obsessively. He established one of the most meticulous, far-reaching and aggressive financial systems England had ever seen. He audited everything, fined everyone, and taxed like it was a competitive sport. While previous kings had taxed for wars or pageantry, Henry taxed for leverage. His court operated like a financial intelligence agency, rooting out unpaid dues, reviving obscure laws, and resurrecting ancient feudal rights to extract payments from nobles who didn't even know they owed anything. If there was a loophole, Henry tightened it. If there wasn't, he invented one, and he did it quietly, coldly, with the precision of an accountant and the moral flexibility of a chess grandmaster. Two shadowy institutions did the heavy lifting: the council learned in the law and the court of Star Chamber. The former specialized in legalistic traps, devising bonds, recognizances and fines so complex they could bankrupt a noble without breaking a single law. The latter enforced these policies with quiet brutality. Both were instruments of control, and both fed Henry's insatiable hunger for financial dominance. Every coin collected wasn't just wealth, it was insurance. Every noble reduced to financial dependence was one less potential rebel. Every chest of gold secured was a brick in the fortress of Tudor legitimacy. But even that wasn't enough. Henry didn't just want to be solvent, he wanted to be untouchable. He personally inspected financial records, not skimmed, inspected. He kept his own ledgers. He oversaw royal income the way a captain inspects the hull of a leaking ship. It said he could quote the value of entire counties. He knew who owed what, when it was due, and exactly how long he could wait before demanding payment with a sudden knock at the door. And yet, the man himself was far from lavish. Unlike his son Henry VIII, who would burn through fortunes on palaces and feasts, Henry VII lived modestly. His court was austere, his meals plain. His clothing, though regal, lacked the indulgent sparkle of other monarchs. The treasure wasn't for spending, it was for having, for hoarding, for holding on to with iron-knuckled fear, because fear, in the end, was the quiet engine behind it all. Henry feared instability, rebellion, pretenders, plots. He feared the same collapse that had ended so many kings before him. His reign was haunted by ghosts with names like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, impostors who claimed his throne and sparked uprisings. Each one defeated, yes, but each one leaving behind the residue of anxiety, of what-ifs, of how close it hads. Money, in contrast, was silent, obedient. It didn't rebel, it didn't conspire, it just accumulated, and accumulate it did. By the end of his reign, in 1509, Henry had amassed what was then the largest royal treasury in English history, hidden in coffers, stashed behind palace walls, stacked in chambers no one entered without permission. He left behind not just a kingdom, but a vault. Not just a dynasty, but a warning. That power, once gained, must be guarded, not with swords, but with silver. And guard it he did, right down to his final days. Even on his deathbed, Henry was said to be preoccupied with finances, not with the state of his soul, not with family, with the ledgers, the records, the balance. He died a king surrounded not by cheering subjects or sobbing courtiers, but by the quiet echo of wealth being counted again and again. But while Henry VII found his obsession in hoarding what others craved, another royal would turn craving itself into a royal identity. A prince turned king whose appetite knew no boundaries, not for perfume, not for clothes, and certainly not for food. A man who didn't just indulge, but consumed until indulgence became its own form of legacy. 21. George IV, food and indulgence. George IV had an appetite that belonged to another species, not just in size but in nature. It wasn't human hunger, it was royal hunger, warped and inflated through years of unchecked access, bottomless ego, and an almost operatic need to consume as proof of existence. He didn't eat for sustenance or even pleasure, not really. He ate for identity, for performance, and for the strange, twitching comfort of extravagance. Food was his language. It was how he communicated mood, power, boredom, triumph, grief, amusement, and most of all, entitlement. If his father, George III, had found peace in the rhythms of agriculture and the predictability of clocks, George IV found meaning in the thunderous arrival of a 10-course meal delivered on gold-plated trays by a dozen liveried servants. His indulgence was theatrical. His meals were measured in volume, not variety. He would order entire menus rewritten on a whim. His breakfasts could feed small armies. Lunch was often redundant, swallowed by the momentum of continuous grazing. And dinner? Dinner was a ritual, a decadent ceremonial descent into gluttony that could last for hours, punctuated by imported wines, rich sauces, and the occasional collapse into an upholstered chair to recover. George had a particular fondness for presentation. The food had to look royal before it tasted royal. Everything, roasts, puddings, pies, jellies, had to be shaped, glazed, sculpted, or flamed. He was especially drawn to dishes that shimmered, dishes that oozed, dishes that carried an air of danger in their preparation. One of his favorite indulgences was a multi-layered trifle served in an etched crystal bowl the size of a bassinet. He once sent back a perfectly good ham because the glaze didn't glisten convincingly. By the time he was crowned king in 1820, George had long since passed from eccentric gourmand to compulsive overindulger. His physical body bore the cost. His weight ballooned, his mobility diminished, and his health quietly unraveled beneath the silken starch. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. His eating had become ritualized, self-defining. Each forkful wasn't just food. It was evidence that he was still in charge. Of the kitchen, of the palace, of his own story. There's something both ridiculous and tragic about the lengths he went to in service of his indulgences. He would summon chefs from the continent for temporary posts that cost more than entire diplomatic missions. He had custom silverware made to accommodate his changing grip. He insisted that each dish be recorded, not just for the menu, but for posterity. In his mind, food wasn't ephemeral, it was legacy. And this legacy came with consequences. His court grew weary, his doctors despaired, even his loyal valet reportedly begged him to slow down after witnessing a particularly unhinged midnight feast involving oysters, game pie, and a small leg of mutton. George refused. The king ate as the sun set. The king ate as the empire shifted. The king ate as his relevance thinned and his waistband thickened. Yet despite the grotesque scale of his indulgence, there was no joy in it. Not really. The food was elaborate, but the emotion behind it was flat. Eating had become mechanical, compulsive, a habit born not of celebration, but of avoidance. The more he felt politically sidelined, the more he buried himself in sources. The more his public image was mocked, the more he demanded desserts plated in gold leaf. He wasn't trying to delight in the meal, he was trying to disappear into it. And in the end, he very nearly did. By the time of his death in 1830, George IV was nearly unrecognizable from the handsome, fashionable Prince of Wales he'd once been. He could barely walk. He suffered from a litany of health issues, many of them connected directly to his compulsive consumption. His body had become a palace of symptoms, and yet the royal kitchens never slowed. The trays still arrived, the courses still came. The theatre of indulgence, like the monarchy itself, refused to end simply because it no longer made sense. What remains of George's reign is not policy or principle, but decadence. A man who devoured everything in reach, food, wealth, reputation, until he was padded by velvet and isolated by sugar and sauce. But not every monarch consumed in the literal sense. Some were consumed from within, by ideas, obsessions and faiths so overwhelming they made even the most practical decisions feel like rituals. One king, in particular, became hopelessly entangled in the rhythms of his religion, not as a source of peace, but as a consuming fire he could not put out. 22. James II, Catholic ritual obsession. James II didn't dabble in Catholicism. He didn't flirt with it, entertain it as an aesthetic, or keep it tucked away as a private eccentricity. He surrendered to it, fully, totally, ritual by ritual, bead by bead, mass by mass. His religion wasn't just a belief system. It became his lens, his compass, his armor, his undoing. And at the heart of that belief was an addiction to Catholic ritual so fervent, so persistent, and so politically dangerous that it eventually cost him his throne. Born into the Church of England but converted to Catholicism later in life, James didn't make the switch as a quiet act of conscience. He converted like a man jumping from a burning ship. He clung to Rome not just for salvation, but for identity. His brother, Charles II, had danced between compromise and pragmatism. James, by contrast, waded straight into the fire of religious division, and once he entered that sacred space, he never left it. The rituals consumed him. It began with daily attendance at Mass, first quietly, in private chapels, then more overtly. What started as personal devotion turned into a campaign of public displays. High masses in full regalia, incense heavy in the air, gilded vestments, Latin prayers echoing through once Anglican spaces. He surrounded himself with Jesuit confessors. He kept a rotating schedule of devotions, novenas, and private liturgies. His chambers were filled with devotional icons. His days were structured not by affairs of state, but by the liturgical calendar. He would pause meetings for prayer, disappear for hours into sacred spaces, cancel state obligations for religious observances that few in England even understood. To his Protestant ministers, it was alienating. To his Catholic advisers, it was exhausting. James practiced faith like a king conducting a military campaign, strategically intense, spiritually absolute, and devoid of compromise. But his obsession wasn't about saving souls, it was about certainty. James was not a naturally flexible man. He lacked his brother's wit, his father's tragic gravitas, or his nephew's charm. What he did have was conviction, unyielding, unquestioning, and eventually unmanageable. In Catholicism, he found rules, order, structure, a divine right that couldn't be challenged by parliament or petition. Where law was messy and monarchy unstable, religion, his religion, was an eternal truth. And truth, in James's hands, quickly became policy. When he became king in 1685, he immediately began reshaping the state around his religious convictions. He repealed anti-Catholic laws, appointed Catholics to high office, and overrode Anglican traditions in education, the military, and the judiciary. These weren't gestures of pluralism, they were acts of devotion. He was, in essence, trying to re-Catholicize a country that had long since moved on. And through it all, the rituals multiplied. He imported Catholic priests, sponsored churches, commissioned Catholic art. Even his personal life became a kind of living liturgy. There were whispers, some exaggerated, some disturbingly accurate, about the number of masses said daily at court, about the incense fog that lingered in the corridors, about James kneeling alone for hours, rosary in hand, whispering prayers that no one dared interrupt. But religion in 17th century England was never just personal. James's relentless devotion alienated the political class, terrified the Anglican clergy, and enraged the Protestant majority. His subjects didn't see a pious king, they saw a potential tyrant, one who would elevate Rome over London, the Pope over Parliament, and sacred mystery over national identity. Even his attempts at toleration were self-sabotaged by the way he imposed them. He issued the Declaration of Indulgence, granting religious freedom to Catholics and dissenters alike, not as a calculated act of statecraft, but as a divine mission, and when the bishops pushed back, he had them imprisoned. Faith, for James, was not a private compass, it was a crown. It all culminated in 1688, when his wife gave birth to a Catholic heir, an event that more than any sermon or statue shattered the illusion of tolerance. England could tolerate a Catholic king, barely. It could not tolerate a Catholic dynasty. The Glorious Revolution followed swiftly. William of Orange invaded. James fled. Even in exile, James clung to his rituals. At Saint-Germain in France, he lived out his days not as a defeated monarch, but as a self-styled martyr king, convinced he had suffered for God. He attended Mass daily, engaged in lengthy confessions, kept fasts with fanatical discipline. Some said he was happier in exile, surrounded by monks and liturgy, than he ever had been in England. He didn't lose his crown, he simply traded it for a cassock. James II's obsession with ritual wasn't a failure of belief, it was a triumph of it. A triumph so complete, it left no room for nuance, negotiation, or national survival. He believed that if he prayed hard enough, long enough, faithfully enough, everything else would align. It didn't. And yet, while James surrendered to incense and invocation, another king would fill his courts not with saints, but with spaniels. Not with holy relics, but with wagging tails, proving that even monarchs who feared no god could be ruled entirely and absurdly by their dogs. 23. Charles II, dogs everywhere. Charles II was a king with a famously crowded court. Courtiers, mistresses, poets, scientists, secretaries, alchemists, and dogs. So many dogs, small ones mostly, furry, floppy-eared creatures that trailed behind him like velvet tassels. They sat on his lap during council meetings, wandered freely through his royal chambers, and were given more consideration than some foreign ambassadors. Charles II didn't just keep dogs, he collected them, pampered them, prioritized them, and most of all, listened to them. The breed he loved most would eventually bear his name, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. And no, that's not a flattering coincidence. That's legacy. He loved these dogs so much that entire palaces were structured around their presence. Historians estimate he kept dozens at a time. The royal kennels, once a practical part of the court's hunting apparatus, became more like aristocratic dog spas. Plush bedding, private attendants, and hand-fed diets were the standard, but what looked, at first glance, like a harmless royal eccentricity, just a man who liked dogs, was something more complicated. This was attachment disorder by royal decree, a compulsion to fill emotional gaps with soft fur and wet noses. A kingdom ruled by a man increasingly convinced that canine loyalty was the only pure thing left. The behavior started early and grew with him. During his years in exile, following the execution of his father, Charles I, Charles found himself adrift across European courts, uncertain, dependent, humiliated, and yet always accompanied by his dogs. They were a reminder of home, yes, but more importantly, they were constant. In a life defined by shifting alliances and conditional hospitality, the spaniels stayed. They didn't ask for titles. They didn't betray him in pamphlets. They didn't bargain. They sat. When he was restored to the English throne in 1660, he brought them with him, not just literally but culturally. These weren't pets. They were symbols. Proof that loyalty, devotion, and gentleness still had a place in a monarchy rebuilt from ash and trauma. Charles's court was infamously decadent, intellectually brilliant, morally flexible, and politically tense. In that chaotic stew, the dogs were a quiet, absurd constant. They were allowed everywhere. Everywhere, in the bedchambers, in Parliament, in royal carriages and council chambers. During state audiences, they'd curl up under tables or stare curiously at visiting dignitaries. At one point, a member of parliament tried to introduce a law banning dogs from public buildings because the king's dogs kept wandering into court sessions. Charles responded by letting them in more frequently. There's something darkly amusing about a monarch so traumatized by civil war and regicide that he coped by surrounding himself with 12-pound spaniels. But make no mistake, this wasn't escapism. It was a full-blown, institutionalized indulgence. Royal household records show generous budgets allocated to dog care. Special servants were assigned to walk and feed them. Litters were born and raised within the palace. Names were given out like titles: Dot, Rogue, Snipe, Mustard. Charles knew them all. If one went missing, entire departments were sent searching, and his courtiers followed suit. To please the king, nobles began acquiring similar breeds. Spaniels became political accessories. Being seen with one at court signalled closeness to the monarch. Some nobles even pretended to like dogs just to secure favour, only to be caught flinching when one jumped into their lap during dinner. But for Charles, the dogs weren't political. They were personal. He trusted them in ways he could never trust people. Perhaps because they didn't remind him of the fragility of kingship or the collapse of his father's rule. They didn't carry the scent of betrayal or the weight of legacy. They didn't care about Catholic plots or Puritan sermons. They were warm. They were loyal. They didn't ask questions. They listened. In this light, the dogs weren't a distraction. They were a mirror. Charles, for all his intelligence and charisma, was a deeply lonely man. Haunted by what he'd seen, what he'd lost, and what he knew could happen again. His charm was legendary, but his inner circle was thin. His trust came slow. But dogs gave it freely. Even his final days reflected the pattern. On his deathbed in 1685, Charles reportedly murmured apologies to those he'd wronged, asked for time he no longer had, and issued orders for the care of his animals. He made arrangements for his dogs to be looked after. For a king who'd lived through regicide, exile, restoration, and endless scandal, that's what made it onto the final checklist. And while Charles found solace in wagging tails and soft ears, another king, his own descendant, would look not to earth but to the sky for peace, not for affection but for answers. A man who turned his gaze heavenward, obsessively, relentlessly, hoping the stars might tell him something the crown could not. 24. George III. Astronomy and stargazing. George III is often remembered for two things: losing America and losing his mind. The first is partially true. The second is deeply misunderstood. But both of those legacies obscure something stranger, quieter, and in many ways more revealing about the man behind the crown. George III was addicted to the stars, not in the vague, poetic sense, not in the way romantics look skyward for inspiration. George was obsessed with astronomy, scientific, mathematical, obsessive stargazing. He built his own observatory. He bought the best telescopes in Europe. He read star charts with the focus of a scholar and the intensity of a man trying to find something more precise than his own royal existence. In the stillness of the night sky, he found something he couldn't get from Parliament, from power, or from his famously chaotic family: order, harmony, celestial certainty. It began in earnest in the 1760s as the Enlightenment swept through Europe, and George, young, newly crowned and eager to be a modern monarch, began investing heavily in science and technology. While other kings were building palaces, George was building instruments. He developed a personal correspondence with astronomers. He acquired planetary models, and most importantly, he commissioned a royal observatory at Richmond, now known as Kew Observatory, which became his private sanctuary of measurement and stars. There, tucked away from court intrigue and political bickering, George surrounded himself with precision instruments: sextants, transit telescopes, orreries and chronometers. He personally attended astronomical observations, often dragging members of his household into late-night vigils under the open sky. His favourite companion in these endeavours was Stephen de Mainbray, a royal science tutor who provided him with lessons on physics, magnetism, and of course, the movements of the heavens. For George, astronomy wasn't about idle curiosity, it was about certainty. It provided a framework in which everything had a place. The stars did not rebel, the planets did not lie, the moon did not hold elections. It moved in its orbit predictably, beautifully, like a cosmic machine built by something, anything, more reliable than politics. And politics for George was never reliable. His reign was defined by instability, rebellion in the colonies, political factions at home, shifting ministers, public protests, and behind it all, a creeping sense that the crown no longer held the authority it once did. Even at the height of his power, George was surrounded by forces he couldn't quite control. But the constellations above Q, they obeyed. One of his most significant obsessions was the transit of Venus, a rare astronomical event in which the planet Venus passes directly between the Earth and the Sun, appearing as a small black dot crawling across the solar disk. George oversaw the 1769 transit personally. He arranged for careful observations at his observatory, invited scientists to participate, and monitored the event with almost religious attention. He was captivated. It wasn't just a rare cosmic phenomenon. It was a demonstration of unity between time and motion, between what could be seen and what could be calculated. Observing the transit wasn't just watching the heavens, it was proving them. And George loved proof. He poured funding into scientific projects. He supported the Royal Society. He sponsored chronometer trials for determining longitude at sea. He backed William Herschel, the astronomer who discovered Uranus, in 1781. In fact, George was so impressed that he gave Herschel a pension and a new title, King's Astronomer. Herschel, ever gracious, tried to name the newly discovered planet after George, Georgium Sidus, a suggestion the rest of the world politely ignored in favour of something more Latin. Still, the gesture revealed just how embedded George had become in the scientific identity of his reign. He wasn't just a patron of astronomy, he was possessed by it. And yet, as his gaze turned ever upward, his grip on earthly affairs began to slip. By the late 1780s, George began experiencing episodes of what his doctors would later call madness. Historians have debated the cause for centuries: porphyria, bipolar disorder, arsenic poisoning, but regardless of diagnosis, the symptoms were real. He became erratic, incoherent, obsessive. He spoke rapidly, leapt between topics, and exhibited a frantic kind of mental motion that echoed the orbits he once tracked so carefully. But even in these episodes, his mind returned to the stars. There are records of George speaking obsessively about planetary alignments, eclipses, time calculations, and celestial cycles, long after others had stopped listening. His private notes from this period contain scattered references to stars and measurements. The sky remained a fixed point, even as everything else collapsed. After his first major breakdown, George briefly recovered. He resumed his royal duties, resumed his walks in the observatory gardens, resumed his quiet, meticulous readings of the night sky. But the clarity didn't last. His mind deteriorated in waves, each one a little darker, a little longer. By 1810, his condition had worsened beyond return. His son, the future George IV, was appointed Prince Regent. George III lived out his remaining years in Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and entirely withdrawn. But even there, alone in his mental fog, the rhythms of his old habits persisted. It is said that his rooms still contained instruments from Q, that he still muttered star names under his breath, that he still asked occasionally for updates on planetary movements long after he could see them. He had lost his vision, lost his throne, lost his reason, but the stars remained. In a way, George III's obsession with astronomy was not just about science, it was about reassurance. In a world where kings fell, nations fractured, and minds unraveled, he wanted something permanent, something vast, quiet, and truthful. something that didn't change when he did. But not all royal addictions gazed skyward in search of meaning. One monarch, centuries before George, cast his longing downward into the keys of instruments, into melody and rhythm, obsessed not with the movement of planets, but with the movement of notes. A king who ruled not just with a sword, but with a lute. 25. Henry VIII. Music and instruments. When people think of Henry VIII, they imagine the mountain of a man in his later years. Thick-necked, irritable, bloated by power and venison, scowling beneath a heavy crown. The tyrant king who shattered the Catholic Church's hold on England with a flick of legislative arrogance. The marital executioner, the royal glutton, the hammer of monasteries. But before the gout, before the wives, before the thunder of war and schism, there was a boy in a velvet doublet, hunched over a lute, humming softly. Because Henry VIII wasn't just a tyrant, he was a musician, and not in the courtly, perfunctory way monarchs are sometimes patrons of the arts. No, Henry composed. He performed. He played, and not as a ceremonial flourish, but with obsessive, almost childlike immersion. It was his passion, his release, his addiction. He couldn't walk past an instrument without touching it, couldn't hear a melody without trying to improve it. Couldn't resist surrounding himself with sound. From a young age, Henry was groomed not as the heir, that was his older brother Arthur's job, but as the cultured spiritual second son, the one destined for the church. That meant education, that meant refinement, that meant music, and once it entered his bloodstream, it never left. By the time Arthur died and Henry unexpectedly became heir, he already possessed an unusually refined musical sense for a future king. When he ascended the throne at age 17, his court burst into song, literally. The early Tudor court under Henry became a musical renaissance. He didn't just fund music, he lived in it. He composed dozens of pieces, including Pastime with Good Company, a sprightly tune that survives to this day and has been adapted for choirs, lutes, and more modern instrumentation. It's not a footnote, it's an actual playable recorded composition by the king. The lyrics are telling. They praise the pleasures of company, the avoidance of idleness, and the simple joy of merry music. They read like the optimistic manifesto of a young man who hadn't yet started executing friends. But Henry's musical life was far from simple entertainment. He turned it into a full-blown collection mania. He amassed a dizzying collection of instruments, recorders, flutes, harpsichords, viols, virginals, shawms, sackbuts, lutes, clavichords, tabors, organs, both large and small. If it made a sound, he wanted it. He imported rare instruments from Italy and Flanders. He commissioned custom versions with unique tunings and ornamentations. His court's inventory at one point listed over 70 recorders alone, because one or two was clearly not enough. There were rumours, half admiring, half scandalised, that Henry could play any instrument handed to him, and while this was likely exaggerated, it wasn't entirely false. Contemporary sources noted his skill on the lute and virginals in particular. He sang, he read music, he improvised, he debated tunings with court musicians, he corrected tempo, and God help the man who played off-key. Henry didn't just enjoy music, he expected excellence from it. His court musicians were among the best in Europe, and they knew the stakes. Displease the king with a wrong note, and you might find yourself replaced or exiled from court. Please him, and you might be showered with gifts. Music, like everything else in Henry's orbit, was governed by favour and fear. But even as his reign darkened, first with the execution of advisers like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, then with the dissolution of his marriages and the slow decline of his health, Henry's music obsession remained. It didn't vanish with youth. It simply became more private. He would retreat into his chambers, surrounded by instruments, lost in sound. His later years were marked by chronic pain, paranoia, and political isolation, but music was always there, waiting for him like a loyal courtier. Some speculate that in those moments he wasn't the aging monarch with a festering leg and a crumbling legacy. He was the boy again, the second son, the one who could play without judgment, sing without consequence, and shape a world of harmony where no one ever betrayed him. The irony, of course, is brutal. Here was a man who built a nation on discord, who split churches, beheaded wives, shattered monasteries, and left behind a trail of broken alliances. And yet, in his private life, he clung to harmony. He curated instruments as if he could compose a better version of reality. He tried to orchestrate people like notes on a staff, arranged just right, obedient, harmonious. But humans aren't instruments. They don't play on command. And when they played out of tune, Henry responded the only way he knew how, with fury. Still, the instruments never argued, the lute never lied, the organ never plotted. In his music, Henry found the one court he could rule without rebellion. And yet, for all his melody, all his composition, there was a darker refrain behind it. Music wasn't just an escape, it was a structure, a system, a desperate reach for beauty in a life increasingly defined by control and chaos. He didn't just collect instruments, he collected order. That desire for order, whether in sound, in church, or in the court, would haunt the Tudor legacy long after Henry was gone. And still, even as music swelled through the halls of Hampton Court, and the scent of burning incense faded from chapels he'd emptied, another king would rise, not with songs or stars or saints, but with his hands in the dirt. A monarch so addicted to the idea of labour, of manual work, that he scandalised a kingdom simply by digging a ditch.